One that's just joining us, we're going to get started momentarily. We just want to give everyone who registered an opportunity to log in, but we appreciate your support and we're delighted to have you this evening. So thanks again. Looks like we've got folks trickling in here. Again, if you're just joining us, we're going to get started momentarily. Thanks again for joining us. Okay, we should get started. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Michael King, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Southwest Seattle Historical Society. I am delighted to welcome you to this evening's Pressing the System program and panel conversation. We've been looking forward to this program in particular for quite some time. So again, I'm thrilled that you can join us tonight. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that the Southwest Seattle Historical Society and our Log House Museum are located on the traditional land of the Duwamish people, past and present. And we are grateful to the Duwamish people for stewarding this land throughout the generations. The Historical Society is also grateful to this evening's panelists, who will all have a chance to meet momentarily. We are especially grateful as well to our sponsors for their support. So I'd like to take a moment to thank For Culture, Luna Park Cafe, Duwamish Tribal Services, and Home Street Bank. And I'd also like to thank the West Seattle blog for their support of our programming and initiatives. We are, again, we're deeply appreciative, so thank you to them. Finally, we can't do this without all of you. So I want to thank you again for tuning in tonight. I know many of you made a donation to support our programming when you registered this evening, and we are grateful for that support. If you're looking for additional ways to support the Historical Society and our programming, I'd encourage you to purchase a membership to the Historical Society, and you can do that at www.loghousemuseum.org. I know most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with the format of our programs, but if you're joining us for the first time, or if it's been a while since you've had an opportunity to tune in, as a quick piece of housekeeping, we are going to be utilizing the Q&A function in Zoom for the question and answer session this evening. So if you have a question for our panelists tonight, I'd ask that you please type it into the Q&A function, which should be down at the bottom of your screen. Staff from the Historical Society will field those questions for you and direct them to our panelists on your behalf. But with all that said, I'm going to turn things over to Maggie Case, who's the curator here at the Historical Society. Thank you again for joining us, and Maggie, it is all yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. One moment while I share my screen. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Pressing the System. My name is Maggie Case. As Michael said, I'm the curator for the Southwest Seattle Historical Society, and I'm really excited to be joining you all today. I'm going to kick off today's presentation with a brief historical presentation that tells you all about the history of suffrage nationally and locally, and really focusing on why the press was so vital in winning women the right to vote. After that, we'll have a panel discussion with our three guests, Tracy Record from the West Seattle blog, and Bethany Green and Kathy Mulady, who are both Historical Society volunteers. We'll hear a little bit more about them later. And then lastly, we'll round out the night with an opportunity for an audience Q&A. But for now, let's dive right in. So I'm going to start out by giving you all some background information on our inspiration for this exhibit, and then let you know who all the key players are. The first half of this presentation is really going to focus on women's suffrage at large in the US, so keep this stuff in the back of your mind as you hear about the movement at scale. The 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote in the United States in 1920. However, what's often overlooked in this conversation is that multiple states granted suffrage to women before that date. Women's suffrage was granted in Washington in 1910, though the fight for suffrage in the states started all the way back in the 1870s. What a lot of people don't know, though, is that the women of Alki were major players in accomplishing this feat. The Alki Suffrage Club was one of the largest suffrage organizations in the state, but very, very little was known about them. One of our major hopes for this exhibit was to rectify that, to give credit where credit's due, and really highlight the fact that changemakers and activists can come from anywhere and everywhere. While working with this exhibit, though, I was really struck by the plethora of newspaper articles that were written by or about Katherine Smith, the leader of the Alki Suffrage Club. And today's landscape of social media and access to instant messaging and video calls, television reports, newsprint continues to be a vital way for everyday people to understand political news. But in 1910, it was pretty much the only way for people to have access to news. And I really just wanted to unpack the impact that giving Katherine Smith a voice in the Seattle Star had on the suffrage movement at large. At its height, the Alki Suffrage Club had over 200 members, and most of them fell into the same demographic categories. They were white, educated, upper middle class ladies. They had few or no children, and the average age of the members was 46. Of course, these women go way beyond their demographics as well. They were mothers and wives and divorcees and artists and business owners, teachers and musicians, churchgoers and mountain climbers. Everyone had their own reason for being there. In the last decade leading up to women's suffrage passing in Washington, we had three key leaders to follow. We had Katherine Smith, Emma Smith DeVoe, and May Arkwright Hutton. Katherine was the president of the Alki Suffrage Club, so as we proceed, we'll be mostly focusing on her story, though it intersects with the stories of these other prominent leaders as well. Before we get there, though, let's talk a little bit about what the suffrage movement looked like in the United States as a whole. A lot of times when we think about history, we think about these big moments as being final, culminating factors in the story. The 19th Amendment is passed in 1920 and we've reached the crescendo. The rest is epilogue. In actuality, though, suffrage laws change all the time. As recently as 2013, the Supreme Court invalidated parts of the very famous Voting Rights Act of 1965, which initially prohibited racial discrimination in voting and outlawed things like literacy tests as requirements to vote, turning significantly more power over to states to mandate their own voting laws. As recently as a few months ago, there were news stories across the country about Georgia's General Assembly making sweeping changes to the state's voting policies, and a move that experts think are going to restrict access for voting to thousands. It's possible, though, that I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, skipping straight to 2021. Women have been voting on this continent since time immemorial. Indigenous women have been voting, shaping policies, and fighting for women's rights for thousands of years in Native nations across the country. After settlers arrived in the U.S., women's suffrage debates began as early as 1648, when Margaret Brent, who you can see on the right here, demanded a vote in Maryland's colonial assembly. At that point, we were off to the races. By the time 1920 rolled around and the 19th Amendment was ratified, there were only 8 states in the country that had no suffrage for women. Most had partial suffrage, which depended on class, race, citizenship status, marriage status, and a whole host of other factors. Our exhibit, the Alki Suffrage Club, Katherine Smith and Other Female Freaks Who Won the Vote, covers the 5 years leading up to the women's suffrage passing in Washington legislature in 1910, 10 years before the country passed the 19th Amendment. Washington granting women's suffrage is actually considered to be a turning point in the national women's suffrage movement by some historians. Before we passed the suffrage bill, it had been 14 years since any state had granted women's suffrage. After we passed the bill, though, multiple other states followed suit. Having said that, though, the bill that passed in 1910 was not the first piece of legislation that addressed women's suffrage in Washington's history. In fact, the first vote for women's suffrage was proposed by Arthur Denny in 1853, before Washington was even a state. Had that bill been approved, all white women over the age of 18 would have been allowed to vote. It didn't pass, though, and it's speculated that that's partially due to the fact that Native American women, as well as all women of color, were excluded from the bill, and many of the lawmakers voting on the bill were married to Native American women at the time. The suffrage movement didn't really kick off here in earnest until 1871, when Susan B. Anthony and Abigail Scott Duniway toured the Pacific Northwest. Susan B. Anthony, of course, is one of the most famous names in the women's suffrage and women's rights movement. Abigail Scott Duniway was a women's rights activist from Oregon and was one of the most influential women for bringing women's suffrage to the Pacific Northwest at large. They ended their tour of the Northwest in Olympia, where Susan B. Anthony became the first woman ever to address the Washington legislature. The next day, a suffrage bill was introduced where it failed yet again, but at this point, there was really a fire lit under many, many women in the state to try and get suffrage passed. The first time women in Washington state won full voting rights was in 1883, but the bill was struck down in 1887 by the Territorial Supreme Court. Another voting bill was passed a year later in 1888, but was immediately overturned. So the question arises, why the back and forth? One major desire to women's suffrage was actually to use their votes to affect liquor legislation, and during the times that they had the right to vote, they did. Prohibition, alcohol accessibility, and suffrage are deeply intertwined parts of history, which is maybe a lecture for another day, but the power of women's vote caused the state's liquor lobby to push really, really hard to overturn women's suffrage, and for a long time they succeeded. By the time 1910 rolled around, many states had some form of suffrage for women, and Washington was no exception. In 1890, women's voting rights were passed for measures related to school elections, but school elections only. This was a really common bill throughout the country. The ideological underpinning was that home and children were in the women's sphere and that managing schooling counted as part of that. So our exhibit follows three key leaders in the suffrage movement: Emma DeVoe, May Arkwright Hutton, and Katherine Smith. Emma DeVoe and May Arkwright Hutton are really well known to many historians as part of the suffrage movement. Both women advocated for and lobbied for women's suffrage in other states on the West Coast after achieving suffrage in Washington. Smith, though, fell off historians' radar, even though she was the founder and president of the Alki Suffrage Club, which later became the Washington Suffrage League. The Alki Suffrage Club, again, was one of the largest and, most importantly, most engaged suffrage organizations in the state in the year and a half leading up to suffrage passing in November of 1910. Katherine Smith and many of the other suffragists used the still hunt approach to win women's suffrage. The emphasis here wasn't on public rallies or political power. Instead, the movement rebranded itself. It wanted to focus on wives, mothers, and sisters. Their goal was to influence men in their lives to vote for suffrage. It was a more subtle approach in some ways. They distributed literature, they made a cookbook, they put posters up everywhere. In the state, they also enlisted the help of the Washington State Grange and labor unions. Newspapers were actually one of the key ways in which Smith was able to spread her still hunt message, that women would still be women even if they got the right to vote. Smith was able to use her voice in newspapers to showcase the fact that giving women the power to vote would be a boon to society rather than a hindrance. I'm going to read you all a quote from the organization that Smith run. This is the Alki Suffrage Club's appeal to voters, which ran in multiple newspapers around King County. What women do not want. We don't want to be men, not to usurp men's place in the world. We don't want to enter politics, become politicians, nor hold political office. We don't want to deprive men of their rights, restrict their liberty, nor ruin their business. We don't want to overthrow the government, nor break up the home. What women do want. We are perfectly satisfied that we are women. We are proud of our sphere, and we believe we occupy a very important place in the position, a very important position in the scheme of creation. We love our homes, which in the aggregate make the government, and we ask for the ballot that we may preserve and protect those homes and the government. We ask that we be granted our inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, for which our forefathers fought and died. To secure those rights, they established this government, deriving its just powers from the consent of the governed. Smith went on to have her own column in the Seattle Star talking about women's suffrage. Some days she wrote her own thoughts, but more often than not, she was curating a variety of women's perspectives, discussing why they felt that suffrage was so important for women. On the screen on the right, we see one such column where Mrs. H.P. Fish offered up two of the really key components of the still hunt perspective. One, that being able to vote would actually enable her to be a better, more effective mother, and everyone knew that women needed all the help they could get to raise the next generations. And two, women aren't the ones who need to be convinced that suffrage is necessary. Instead, it's men that need to see the benefits that society would gain if women had suffrage and then vote to pass the bill accordingly. Even in the newspaper announcement that the Star put out letting readers know that Smith would be creating a daily column, they framed her through the still hunt method, reminding readers that Smith came from Denver, Colorado, where women already had the right to vote. And what had Smith done with that right? She set up a juvenile court to assist children. The Star was also always careful to point out the fact that the fight for women's suffrage transcended class lines and that women from all walks of life wanted the right to vote. Smith's perspective was just one, but by giving her a voice in the Star, she was able to speak for many. Although her column, of course, wasn't the only newspaper coverage that she or the movement was getting at the time. The Tacoma Times was a very frequent follower of her work, both before and after the vote for women's suffrage passed in the state. In December of 1910, about a month after suffrage passed, they used Katherine to describe today's American woman, one who puts away social cards and calling and instead puts her considerable social skills, friendships, and in Katherine's case, wealth to be put to use to better society. Like all movements, though, Washington's suffrage movement had its own set of barriers and challenges. Some were personal. There was a lot of discord between DeVoe and Hutton, which Smith often found herself in the middle of, and some were political. As I mentioned earlier, women's suffrage had very, very large and very organized opposers in the liquor industry. Others opposed women's suffrage from a more personal bent. Women were seen as too weak-minded, too emotional, too uneducated, too gentle. And if this sounds familiar to you, it's because the same rhetoric is used today to disenfranchise women in politics. Katherine, though, often took on suffrage opponents personally, through conversation and on the page. Once, while recovering from an illness in Hawaii, Katherine managed to convince the mayor of Honolulu to support suffrage. She also took on one of the most prominent opponents of suffrage, a fire and brimstone preacher named Reverend Matthews, who famously referred to suffragists as female freaks. Katherine didn't stand for this. She criticized the Reverend and said that his holier-than-thou attitude would be his undoing. The Reverend made his complaint in a letter to the editor for the Seattle Star, as well as preaching it to anyone who would listen. But it was Katherine's response to Matthews that earned her the column in the Seattle Star, where she presented arguments for suffrage every day until the election. Of course, though, we also have the barrier to a full celebration of women's suffrage here, which is the inequity that existed within these bills. Famously, the 19th Amendment allowed women to vote, but in practice generally excluded women of color. Washington's bill specifically allowed Black and white women to vote so long as they were citizens. Citizenship was often the rub with voting rights. Asian Americans only won the vote in 1943 due to being ineligible for naturalization, and Native Americans weren't considered citizens until 1924, and many, many people were denied the right to vote at all until 1965, regardless of citizenship status. And in practice, many Black individuals were denied the right to vote for decades, even though legally they were allowed. Additionally, Black activists were organizing and fighting for the right to vote alongside white activists during this time period, but many of their names are now lost to history and they're separated out from these conversations. Suffragists and anti-suffragists alike often spoke the shared language of racism. These conversations about rights are often celebrated as separate milestones, but in fact, the work to rectify racial inequities and gender-based inequities are highly tied together historically, and of course are still happening today. So while we're really excited to be talking about women's suffrage, it's also really important to acknowledge the fact that this win wasn't a win for everybody. All right, we're going to switch gears now a little bit and enter our panel conversation. So if all of my panelists wouldn't mind coming on the screen here. Hello, everybody. I'm going to ask you to start out by introducing yourselves. Tracy, would you mind going first? Can you just tell us a little bit about you and your background?
Hi there, I'm Tracy Record, and I'm editor, co-publisher of West Seattle Blog. And this is perhaps the last act in a really long journalistic career that's gone back about 40 years now since I joined the high school news. It wasn't the high school newspaper, it was the college newspaper when I first started college. I've worked in newspapers as well as TV and the internet and radio.
Thank you so much. Bethany, would you mind introducing yourself to the audience and telling us a little bit about you?
Hi, I'm Bethany. I've been a volunteer at the Historical Society for a while now. I have a background in genealogy and research, so I was asked to help with this particular exhibit to learn more about the women who made up the Alki Suffrage Club.
Thank you so much. All right, Kathy, last but not least, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hey, good. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel. I was a newspaper reporter for nearly 30 years. I worked in California and Idaho, in Spokane, Washington, and Seattle. And my last paper was the Seattle PI here in Seattle when it closed about 12 years ago. And in the meantime, I became a communications director for nonprofit progressive organizations that works on issues similar to this, including voting rights.
Thank you very much. Thank you all three of you for being here today. I'm really excited for our conversation. Kathy, I'm going to keep you in the hot seat for a second and kick us off with you. Katherine Smith herself wasn't necessarily a trained journalist, but often found herself writing columns to advocate for women's suffrage. I have dozens and dozens that we didn't see in today's presentation. With objective reporting being one of the goals of journalism as I understand it today, how do news resources use opinion columns to offer a different perspective to their readers?
Okay, well, newspapers such as the Seattle Times still publish op-eds, letters to the editors, guest columns, and columns by columnists from other news organizations. They have editors who fact check those opinion columns. Unfortunately, there's fewer and fewer newspapers, and they are smaller and smaller, and they have less room to include a variety of opinions. So a lot of voices are left out. I was really interested to learn about the Seattle Star. I've been kind of fascinated by it for a little while. Around this time in the early 1900s, it was one of the largest of the three newspapers, daily newspapers in Seattle. And it was also progressive and liberal and represented the workers and really tried hard to include a lot of voices. I was actually amazed to see that they gave her such a prominent column. I think it started out on the women's pages, but later migrated to some of the main part of the Seattle Star. So really, really interesting, and something that was perhaps lost in Seattle over the next many decades. She was really a trailblazer, and perhaps that came from her position in society, and her ability to write these columns, to interview people, and to know the right people at the newspapers to kind of have this influence. The press today, I think, still has a responsibility of giving a voice to those who don't have one. And of course, we have a lot more opportunities online, including, social media. But I can leave it right there, and I'm sure that's going to come up as a topic as we continue on.
Yeah, absolutely. Tracy, do you have anything to add on to that about how journalists today are able to sort of use op-eds to sort of round out what they're able to offer?
Well, the interesting part about it is that things have really changed. And in some cases, some publications, the journalists themselves are encouraged to have and to voice opinions, which I'm sort of old school. That kind of goes against my grain. But what excites me the most is the fact that there are, as Kathy alluded to, so many different ways to voice opinions. I like to think, in learning a little bit about Ms. Smith, that she might have been a prolific commenter as well as somebody who had perhaps, a website of her own, a blog of her own, an opinion blog. She probably would have had a Facebook page, and she would have piped up on, other topics that came up and said, if women had the vote, here's how this would have been different. So definitely things have changed over the decades, but as Kathy, noted as well, it's still important. For example, the New York Times recently changed their name from an op-ed section to an opinion section, because what they publish are essays written by people on a wide variety of topics, not just political, not just topics that are the news of the day. And that's a really important place, even if it's a national newspaper that's read around the country, around the world, to convene different kinds of discussions.
Thank you very much. Switching gears just a little bit to talk a little bit more about the historical. Bethany, we're going to put you in the hot seat now. I know that you did a lot of the research for this exhibit, and many of the primary source documents that I have from the work that you and our previous staff members did were actually newspaper articles written by and about Katherine. And I was wondering if you were surprised by the amount of newsprint materials you were able to find about her and how that might have differed from other research projects you've done, either for the Historical Society or otherwise.
I wasn't really surprised by the amount of newsprint. I knew going into this project that it was very high profile, something that people were really talking about that is going to attract a lot of attention. So I knew that that would generate coverage in newspapers. So this is quite different from other research projects I've done, both for the Historical Society and other various projects, where you're mostly looking at ordinary, lower profile people who aren't necessarily generating the kind of coverage that you would expect in a high profile campaign. So yeah, this was quite different.
Oh, that's really interesting to hear. I think especially when put into the context of the fact that even though Katherine Smith was really high profile at the time, throughout history, her name kind of disappeared into the aether. So it's interesting to kind of see that juxtaposition. Tracy, switching back to sort of news today, I'm curious about how your approach to reporting political issues might differ from how you report on other kinds of news, and why that either is or isn't the case.
Politics can be categorized in a couple of different ways. And in my case, if it's politics and it's party politics, it's election politics, that's covered one way different from what I would consider the suffrage battle. Of course, it's easy to look on it, from hindsight and also from, being female myself, but that I would have considered a civil rights issue. Right now in the news business, there's a lot of decrying what they call the both sidesism, which is where people write stories and they feel that they're being fair if they just get a dissenting opinion, regardless of examining the dissenting opinion critically. In this case, well, why wouldn't you give, half the human race the vote? And the same thing, has gone in our way of some of the other issues that have happened in recent years, such as, same-sex marriage. Why wouldn't you? It could be argued that the other side of it is not even valid or worthy of discussion because what you're doing is you're arguing to deny somebody their civil rights. So it's really all over the map in terms of the ways that things are covered. But when it comes down to basic politics, it is important to be fair and to give people of, both or all parties their coverage as well.
Thank you. That's a really important distinction that I wasn't necessarily thinking about when I crafted these questions. So that's really valuable insight. Kathy, do you have anything to add either about, politics versus civil rights, or kind of how your reporting for political issues might differ from other kinds of news?
That's great. Yes. I think Tracy said a lot about the issue, but some of the political issues that we're working on right now are voting rights, minimum wage, healthcare for all, clean water. All of these issues have multiple sides. Nothing has just two sides. Always, for me, in all these cases, the goal is to bring to light information that might not otherwise be known, asking questions to help voters better understand the depth and all sides of the issue. For example, I was also a business reporter, and covering corporations requires the same type of diligence and attention and investigation as covering government and political issues. Political issues impact our quality of lives, our rights, our communities. Our political leaders are elected and they are accountable to us, and it's up to the media to hold them accountable.
Thank you for sharing. That's really, really interesting. Bethany, this might feel like a bit of an aside, but I thought it was worth asking while we had you here. One of the coolest parts of the exhibit, in my opinion, is the replica dress that you made for us in a similar fashion to what Katherine would have worn in 1910. Can you tell us a little bit about that process? I thought it was really interesting the ways in which fashion was used to reinforce the still hunt movement and to sort of disengage, I guess, with this fear that women wanted to be voted to become more manly or something of that nature.
Yeah, there's a lot of coverage in the newspaper about what she's wearing. I think it's fascinating to see that perspective. But of course, like we see that today, especially female politicians and other public figures are like we talk about their outfits all the time, and people have always used their clothing to send a message. And so I think Katherine is really, you can really see that in her choices. She's still staying feminine, traditional. So it reinforces her still hunt, as we call it. I also think that she just genuinely liked fashion, so this was a fun thing for her to use to bolster her arguments. As for the outfit I made, I have an academic interest in historical fashion. Like I sew, but I'm not really a dressmaker. I'm a quilter. But when Rachel and Tasha asked if I would be interested in making a piece, I thought it'd be really fun to take some of my more academic interest in the subject and actually try to make something that someone could have worn, in circa 1910. So it was really interesting to do some of the research into the more of the practical side of like how garments were constructed. We do of course have sewing machines at this time, but a lot of garments are still hand finished. So I did some handwork on the piece. There's also a question of accessories. Rachel had found a picture in the newspaper of Katherine with this giant flower covered hat on. And so that was a piece she really wanted. So got to attend some millinery, which was a very new experience for me. But yeah, it was just really fun to really get into the practical side of this instead of just reading about different shapes and styles.
That's fascinating. I mean, you did a beautiful job. I never would have guessed that that was the first time that you've made a dress. And for any of you in the audience who haven't been to the museum yet, I highly recommend that you come down, even if it's just to see the dress, because it's really a show-stopping piece. Kathy, you touched a little bit on this in your last answer for us, but often I think that in school we learn a lot about the fact that the press is sort of either called the fourth estate or is kind of the fourth pillar of democracy, with sort of implicit and explicit ways to influence how people think about social issues. How would you describe the role of the press today as that kind of fourth pillar of democracy?
Great, yes. The media is the fourth pillar of democracy. The other three pillars, of course, are the executive branch, the legislative, and the judiciary. The media holds those branches, those pillars, accountable to the people. They are the eyes and the ears, and they keep those other branches transparent and accountable. Reporters, and it's such a really important distinction that we should probably talk about and explore in this conversation, is the real value of having professional paid journalists who can do their work, who go to meetings, who are the eyes and ears, who are backed and supported. Reporters, and it's becoming increasingly rare. And I know that this is something that Tracy can talk about as well, and something that the West Seattle blog brings to our community that probably often we don't recognize enough, is that she goes, while we go to work, she goes to meetings and she talks to government officials, she does reporting, she asks the questions, so that we don't have to do that, because we wouldn't do that. No one would do that. Without people, without reporters and paid journalists, we wouldn't have an idea what our government is up to. But I digress. With so much information flowing at us, we need a way to sort out the truth, and we need a way to sort facts from fallacy and from mere opinion. Media has become so polarized and filled with entertainment and sensationalism and bias. Readers and viewers are called on to interpret that, and they don't have a way to do that. In the last century, in the 1900s, the media fed us the news, and this wasn't an ideal thing either. Newspaper publishers and editors and television executives decided, and they disseminated information that they believed that we needed to know. Information was highlighted on the front page of the newspaper, and you read that information, and that's what you knew for the day. Now there's algorithms that feed us the news, calculating what it thinks that we're interested in. If we depend on our Twitter feeds and our Facebook friends, we might never know what's going on in our neighborhood, in our city, in our state, in our world. And we would never know how dangerously at risk things like our voting rights are.
Thank you for that. That's really interesting. It really highlights the time and energy that journalists are able to put into important issues that other people might not have the time and energy to think about. And digital literacy, especially in this day and age, is just getting more and more important. And it's really important, I think, for people to understand how they're sort of interacting with what they're consuming. Tracy, do you have anything to add on to that about sort of the role of the press as that fourth pillar of democracy?
Well, as teed off by Kathy, she said it very eloquently. The problem that haunts me all the time is that we're currently drowning in information. It's not just the signal to noise ratio, the fact that there are so many different places you can get information and that you have to decide. Even governments put out a tremendous amount of information, but they put it in places where if you don't know where to look for it, if you don't know what you're looking for, if you don't know how to parse it, it doesn't matter. It's like you can both go thirsty and drown at the same time because there's so much out there. And that's one of the vital roles that people doing this professionally still perform, is knowing what to look for, knowing what to ask, knowing what's of interest and knowing what's not. I encounter all the time people who they say, oh, well, I found this bit of information, but they might be misinterpreting it, misreading it. And that's important, even as much so as looking for the information that's not available, which is achieved by people, sending out public disclosure requests and other such things to look under the rocks. It's not even just looking under the rocks, it's even just looking to see what's on top of the rocks, what's out there in the sunshine, and what to do with it. And that's still vital, and we are pretty much in danger as professional news organizations continue to shrink. But I do want to put in a pitch in case it doesn't come up again. It's really important that people continue to support that. Because what's happening now, if people don't pay attention to newspapers, to other news outlets, and just pay attention to, what their best friends, cousins, uncles, mothers, brothers said on Facebook, then everything else is going to wither and die. So, think about the sources and think about the, where to get the information that people really are putting in a lot of work.
Absolutely. Thank you for running a news source that we can trust here in West Seattle. We really appreciate it. And I really am struck as well by the context aspect, I think, that you were talking about too, that one piece of information kind of floating meaninglessly in the sea doesn't actually illuminate very much. But by looking larger, looking at the context of things, that's when you can really start to make connections. And that's what's part of what's so important about the news. Bethany, I've got one last question for you. One of the things that I continue to press up against, no pun intended, I guess, while interpreting this exhibit is the fact that while technically Black and white women were allowed to vote following this law, many of women of color were deliberately excluded. And in practice, many Black women were subject to specific bars that kept them from voting. So I just wanted to get your take, how do you think we can celebrate what women in Washington were able to achieve by gaining voting rights 10 years ahead of the rest of the history, while also contending with the fact that this law left a lot of people behind?
Yeah, this is something I gave a lot of thought to when we started out with this project. In our previous exhibit on the annexation of West Seattle into the city of Seattle, we had included a panel that talked about who was actually able to participate in that vote. And so I knew that was kind of an issue for this exhibit as well. So I went through the 1910 census to get a better sense of the demographics in relation to this new law that was being passed. The text of the law specifically says, there shall be no denial of the elective franchise at any election on account of sex. So, it should mean that every female citizen can vote. However, this says we have to remember that not everyone is a citizen. We have, Indigenous Americans who are not allowed to be citizens yet, and Chinese immigrants were also not allowed to naturalize. And in fact, a lot of Chinese women were not allowed to immigrate at all. We have Japanese, especially in Seattle, we have Japanese immigrants who also are excluded from citizenship. We also have an issue that women's citizenship is tied to her husband's citizenship. So if you are a white, American-born woman who marries a foreigner who hasn't naturalized yet, then you can also be stripped of your right to vote. So I went through the census records for Seattle's 14th ward, which includes West Seattle and also Georgetown, which had both been annexed around the same time. So Seattle, of course, is very white at this time. Washington State is also extremely white. There's about 1.1 million people in this whole state, and only 32,000 are people of color. So specifically in Ward 14 that we were looking at, as that's our service area, there's about 15,000 people in the 14th ward, and I found just a handful of non-white women. There's 3 Indigenous women, 3 Japanese women, 5 Black women, and 3 who are described as mulatto, which of course we don't use that term anymore, but that was the census designation at the time. So we can see that, especially for the people in West Seattle and our service area, that the vast majority of women are allowed to vote under this law. But of course, just because something is allowed, or it's supposed to be a certain way, doesn't mean that it is in practice. There's been a lot of discussion, I think, with the 19th Amendment about who can actually vote in practice. And it really seems like the dominant narrative has been that Black women were prevented from voting across the entire country. And while this is certainly true in parts of the country, especially in the South, I wasn't finding evidence of voter suppression here in Washington State and in Seattle specifically. And I wasn't sure if I was just looking in the wrong places and in primary sources. So I kind of branched out to we've got a historian at the University of Washington whose name is Quinter Taylor, and he's an expert in Black people in the West. And his research has shown that there really was, well, not to say there was no prejudice, but there was minimal prejudice here in Washington in the first part of the 20th century. He specifically says that Black people were not prevented from voting here in the first part of the 20th century. This did change, he says, after, especially after World War II. We get increasing numbers of Black people moving to the area, and of course that changes the dynamics. But for the time period we're focusing on, about 1910, we really do see Black women voting. They aren't being prevented from voting. So I don't want to forget that there are Asian and First Nations women who are excluded from the vote. But I do kind of wonder if we're doing a disservice to the suffrage movement when we focus on these negative things. There was really a huge accomplishment. It really shook up a lot of, how we think about politics in our country. And it kind of seems like the argument keeps getting like, well, if it wasn't perfect, like maybe it wasn't worth doing. And I don't think that's true at all. A victory is still a victory, even if it's not a complete victory. It's of course right to acknowledge that the work wasn't done. But like the American experiment, I think, is really supposed to be about creating a more perfect union. It implies that we are a work in progress. This passage of this bill and allowing women the first step on this path to vote, I think, is an important acknowledgement. And then sometimes I think we are forgetting what a big step this was.
That's really fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much. That's really, really interesting. I think that I kind of came to a similar conclusion as I've been doing interpretation for this program and around this exhibit, generally speaking, that it's still a win worth celebrating. But occasionally you need to add a little bit of an asterisk as well. I am sorry if you can all hear my dog barking. That was terrible timing. Thank you so much, Bethany. I really, really appreciated that. I've got one last question for our journalists as well. Tracy, I'm going to start with you. The fight for voting rights, of course, continues today. What role do you see the press playing in influencing that movement now? And do you have a sense of how it's similar or maybe different to what was happening 110 years ago?
Well, it was mentioned earlier that, you did in your opening remarks that, what's happening now is that rights are being chipped away in different corners of the country. We don't currently necessarily have an entire class of people that's prohibited, although there have been some movements, for example, to grant incarcerated individuals, once they're free, the right to vote again. And then you would also talk about, well, what about when people are immigrants? Is voting really only something that citizens should be? So there are issues like that are being explored, and it's really important just that they continue to be written about And in turn, because it's so hard, sometimes the industry becomes so consolidated, you kind of have to have somebody tugging at your jacket, so to speak. So the role of advocacy organizations is very important, because they're the ones who will really surface the issues, even if you yourself, the journalist, don't have time to look for it, to wonder what's not being written about. Someone will come forward and say, hey, here's what we're fighting for, or here's what we want to call attention to. So their roles are really important, paying attention to what they have to say, not necessarily taking, press releases and press conferences uncritically, but at least using them as jumping off boards. So a lot of that's going to continue, but also paying attention really closely to things that are happening in the proverbial smoke-filled back rooms, or not, like what's been happening in Georgia.
Thank you. Kathy, do you have anything to add to that to kind of round us off for this formal panel discussion portion?
Just a little bit. I just want to make a couple of points that I discovered while preparing for this panel. When we think back into the work that these women were doing in the early 1900s, their public identity of women was really closely tied to their husbands. We see at the top of the column that Katherine writes that she isn't Katherine, she's Mrs. George Smith. She really doesn't have her own name and identity. And yet the work that they needed to do was to convince men to vote, to give women the vote. Women couldn't vote to give themselves the vote. Their whole marketing, their whole public relations, all their media, their marching, it was all directed at men to encourage men to vote. And I love Tracy's point about activists and advocates. If there aren't people out there making noise, fighting for these policies, marching in the streets, it gives reporters and it gives the news something to hang a policy story on. And it's so important for people like Katherine Smith and the 200 women who joined her in Alki to come out and take a position and raise these issues. And we still have to do this. We can't be complacent just because women have the right to vote now. A number of states are working to restrict not the right of women to vote necessarily, but who does have the right to vote. The rights are being eroded. Tracy mentioned incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people, people of color, non-English speaking people. In the past, literacy tests were given and there was poll taxes. And just because those aren't happening right now, it doesn't mean that this fight is over. So we still have to be awake and aware. And the role of the press is to help us know that these issues are still going on. We need to continue to raise awareness and be visible and put the information out there so voters, when they go to the polls, can make the right decision. I think that's it.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a really good note to end on, being aware and not taking anything for granted just because of the ways we perceive things being now. Michael, I'm going to turn it over back to you for some audience Q&A.
Thanks, Maggie, and thanks again to each one of our panelists. It's really striking to me how relevant this history is today, and it seems as though our audience has some questions for you. So I'm going to start from the top. We have a question from Phil, and this might be directed towards either Bethany or Maggie. You said the first bill didn't pass because many members of the government were married to Native American women. Could you elaborate, Maggie? I think that might be in reference to your opening comments.
Yeah, so this is in some ways kind of a tricky and strange bit of history, but many of the original settlers who came here ended up divorcing their wives who were left behind, often in the Midwest, and then took Native American brides. I used took kind of literally there, and those legislators felt really strongly that if women were going to be given the right to vote in Washington State or Washington Territory as it was in 1853, they wanted their wives to have access to that as well. That's probably a whole other lecture in and of itself, to be honest, but that's kind of the broad strokes of it. I don't know exactly how many legislators there were, but there was enough of them that the vote didn't pass by a significant portion of voters.
Thanks, Maggie. We have some questions from Clay. This is a multi-part question, so I'll ask all of them, and perhaps we can break them down one by one. Where was the Alki Suffrage Club headquartered? Where did it meet? Were its members solely or primarily from West Seattle? Did the club's work show up in early newspapers in West Seattle before the West Seattle Herald? Did men participate? And if you came to a club meeting, what would the experience be like? Bethany, I wonder if you might be willing to tackle some of these questions. Maybe we can start with where was the Alki Suffrage Club headquartered, and where did it meet?
Yeah, these are great questions, and unfortunately, we don't really have a lot of like solid answers for these. We don't really have records surviving in the club. We don't have a membership list. All we have is a list of the officers. We don't have any like meetings or minutes from the meetings or anything. So there's not a whole lot that I can say definitively. I will say that there isn't really a headquarters other than Katherine's personal house. We know that a lot of different of the members, or the officers, I should say, officers hosted meetings. I can't say for sure that everybody attended all of the meetings, just because I can't imagine that any one person's house could hold 200 people. We only know that there are about 200 people because we have like newspaper articles saying that the Alki Club is one of the largest clubs in Washington State. So we know there was a lot of interest. We also know that there are other regional clubs. There's a different club in different parts of Seattle. There's different club. I think there's one in kind of like Burien White Center. So a lot of the Alki Suffrage Club members are actually in Alki, or they have summer homes on Alki, so they are spending time there. So I can't remember what the rest of the questions were. I guess I could bring it up here.
Sure. So the next part of the question was, were its members solely or primarily from West Seattle? Did the club's work show up in early newspapers in West Seattle before the Herald? Did men participate? And if you came to a club meeting, what would the experience be like?
Okay, yeah, I've pulled it up here. So yeah, we can't say primarily where this members came from because we don't have a membership list. So we don't actually have the names of these people. Again, I can't say if any men were participating because again, they weren't officers, but that doesn't mean they didn't show up occasionally, or they might have just, provided financial support or other support to their wives who were participating. And we don't have the minutes for the meeting. So I can't say exactly what a meeting would be like. We do know that they were active in going out in public. They participated so the National Suffrage Movement held their annual meeting here in Seattle in 1909. We know Alki Club members were present there and spoke there. We know that they were passing out flyers in public. There's a festival in September of 1910 that was held at Hiawatha to kind of show the city like, oh, look, here's West Seattle. We're actually kind of cool. We're not just a total backwater. We know Alki Club members were there and they handed out pamphlets. We know they had like a picnic lunch a few times over that summer of 1910. So I would think that it would be probably a lot of like camaraderie, like we're all in this together. We have these things we want to accomplish. Here's some ideas of what we can do. Here's ideas how we should talk about these things. I really wish that we had better answers to these questions, but that's about as good as I can give, I think.
Thanks, Bethany. It sounds like an opportunity for more research if time permits, right?
I mean, if the sources survive, it would be great.
We have another question from Phil, and this looks like it might be for all the panelists, but perhaps Tracy and Kathy in particular. Can any of you tell us a newspaper or TV organization, et cetera, in your opinion, that are the most non-biased?
In West Seattle, I would say the West Seattle blog, that's my answer.
Otherwise, again, it's a very subjective issue looking at the matter of what you would consider biased. It's easier to say who's definitely, you can talk about Fox News, some people would consider CNN biased. Well, they have talk show hosts, but then they have actual newscasts, and the newscasts, present things relatively objectively. But I don't know. I would still say that the New York Times seems pretty objective to me, but that's subjective through my eyes.
It's definitely a matter of opinion, and it's very, very subjective. I agree.
Thanks for that. We have another question from an anonymous attendee. If there was a good deal of intermarriage with Native Americans, why was the vote initially lost to that issue? And Maggie, I think you alluded to that a little bit earlier, but perhaps you can speak to this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was lost because the bill that Arthur Denny put forth actually said specifically in the language of the bill that the only woman who would be eligible to vote would be white women over the age of 18. So because it was so, the language was so racially specific that people, men who were married to women of color of all walks of life at that time were like, why would I vote for something that specifically excludes my spouse?
Thanks, Maggie. That's the final question that's come in from our audiences. I want to give everybody an opportunity to, if they're still typing away or thinking about a question, give them another moment to do so. But those are the only questions we have thus far. A question that came to mind, that I had that came to mind, and perhaps one of our panelists might be able to answer it. When in Seattle's history, or perhaps particularly the history of West Seattle, do we begin to see women really emerge as journalists or in the field? Is that a development that happens around this time, later, earlier? I'm very curious about that.
Specifically in the Seattle area, was that your question, Michael?
Yeah, if you can speak to specific to the Seattle area, but I know that it could be a general question as well.
I wish I knew more about the local history. I don't. I'm a relatively late comer to Seattle. I've only been here for 30 years. And by then women were fairly well established. But if you look back at it, in general, the field didn't really start. Nowadays, there are more women going into journalism than men, I've heard and seen. But for example, I started in the late 70s, and I started at my broadcast career at a radio station where I was, quote, the token women, and that was only because there was a federal law that required that they have someone of the other gender on the staff in order to to get their license renewed. So it really hasn't. I would be surprised. There's probably some trailblazer way back when, but it's really about the mid 20th century when things really got going.
Thanks, Tracy.
Yeah, and it was rare in the early days of newspapers to have bylines, so you didn't always know who was the reporter writing the article.
Excellent point. Thanks, Kathy. We've got a few more questions coming in and some thank yous as well. Clay just noted, thanks all. He's got to go to a meeting now, but he really enjoyed this. So thanks for joining us, Clay. We have a question from Jen. What was the legal or constitutional basis for denying women the right to vote? And this might be for Bethany.
This is, I mean, there's not really a whole lot. I mean, the history in our country is that, only men were allowed to vote. We have various restrictions placed on it. There's it's not necessarily a constitutional argument, and because that's how you affect change, is that you have the Constitution say, okay, people in different places are doing different things. We need to come up with something to that will cover everybody. So if women aren't specifically allowed to vote, then it's so, or that it is constitutionally permissible at the time to exclude them. I don't know if I have anything else that's a better answer than that.
I can hop onto that a little bit as well. It wasn't necessarily a constitutional thing, and in many states, actually, there was a history of women voting with no problem because the constitutional language was actually a little bit vague, as much of it is. And really, the reason that it became a law and a big deal was states that took exception to that, or more correctly, probably men who saw women voting and took exception to that and was like, hey, is that allowed? So that was some of the legal basis of it, was just sort of vague language about who even was or wasn't allowed to begin with.
Thank you, Bethany, and thank you, Maggie. We have one final question here from Nancy. And Nancy asks, did the Seattle newspapers editorialize about suffrage in 1910?
They did indeed, a little bit. The Seattle Star did quite a bit, and the Seattle PI as well as the Tacoma Times. Those are the sources that I have most readily available off the top of my head, but I'm sure there were probably more too.
Wonderful. We have some thank yous coming in. We have a thank you from Stacy who says, thank you for all of your research. It was very interesting hearing the history specifically about women of color. Thank you for joining us, Stacy. I think, Maggie, do we have time for any more questions, or are we at time now?
We are at time. Thank you all so very much for coming. And thank you again to our panelists. That was a really lovely and interesting conversation, and I was so happy to have you here. Michael, I'll turn it over to you for the final thank yous.
Sure, thanks. Well, again, yeah, I just want to echo Maggie. Thank you, Bethany. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Kathy. And thank you, Maggie, as well, for facilitating this conversation. It really was magnificent, and I learned a lot, and I hope our audience learned a lot as well. And again, I'm really struck by the parallels and the resonances between the history we've explored and the contemporary moment. I think it really underscores the reality that thinking about the past is critical to understanding our contemporary moment and being engaged in our contemporary moment. So thank you very much for underscoring that for me, and hopefully for our audiences as well. As a friendly reminder to everybody, the Log House Museum has reopened, so we'd love for you to come join us, stop by. We're open Friday to Sundays, noon to 4 p.m. And I'd encourage you specifically to stop by to take a look at our Alki Suffrage Club exhibit. If you enjoyed this evening's program, there's more to learn. And again, there's a wonderful dress to come and take a look at here at the museum that was made by our panelist, Bethany. So thanks again to her for that. Additionally, we've got a lot of programming planned for the summer, and the best way to keep up with that, of course, is to visit our website, loghousemuseum.org, to follow us on social media, and of course, to keep an eye out on the West Seattle blog. So a special thanks again to the blog for their support of what we do here at the Historical Society. Thanks again to our sponsors, again, For Culture, Luna Park Cafe, Duwamish Tribal Services, and Home Street Bank. We can't do this without their support. And most importantly, again, thanks to all of you for joining us. We really do appreciate it. We're going to be looking forward to seeing you next month for our Words Writers Southwest Stories program in just a couple of weeks. And until then, I hope you stay healthy and safe, and we will be looking forward to seeing you soon. Thanks again.